Hi all, we're back for another video. This one is on fiscal policy. I'd be remiss not to give you a little bit of background before I just jump right into it. You have to understand that for the first part of our country's history, and kind of globally, right, this isn't just a US thing, that countries employed what we would consider kind of laissez-faire approaches to the economy. In other words, everybody recognized that there were business cycles, but people believed that the best thing to do when there was a recession or a dip in the economy was basically a hands-off approach, right? Back up, let the market correct itself. That's what we learned about when we studied the classic aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, was that with time, essentially the labor market would adjust, right? Wages would adjust to shift short in aggregate supply to the right or left and bring our economy out of whatever situation was either slowing us down or causing us inflation. So we actively pursued that policy through the late 1800s and into early 1900s, and even at the start of the Great Depression. So stock market crashed in October of 1929. Things didn't get better that year. They were continuing to fall in 1930 and 31 and through the start of 32, which is what essentially ushered in an entirely new president and new regime, ruling party, whatever you want to call it, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who maintained his presidency, I believe, for 16 years as he implemented what was referred to as the New Deal. Now, the New Deal came out of the philosophy of a British economist by the name of Keynes. And if you're in my class, you'll want to know that name when you see that on the test. But Keynes, again, is he still has followers today, what we refer to as Keynesian economists. And they are economists who believe that when you have economic problems, that you should rely on the government, or that you could rely on the government to help solve those situations. So Keynes is essentially the father, if you will, of modern day fiscal policy. So what is fiscal policy? Well, fiscal policy is going to be policies made by government, and I'm referring here largely to our elected officials, our administrators. I'm sure there's some bureaucrats in that mix. I'm referring to things at the federal, state, and local level. All levels of government have the ability to implement or change fiscal policy. So what's included in fiscal policy? Well, the main tools under fiscal policy are going to be government spending. And if you remember from an earlier video, government spending technically does not include transfer payments, but we're going to kind of lump these in together here. Things like unemployment benefits, and then taxes. So, for example, if you're living in Georgia right now, we have some of the lowest gas prices in the nation. Why? Because we suspended our gas tax when the prices were rising I guess a month or two ago. Your local government, right, can change rates on property taxes if they so choose. And of course, the federal government is looking at income tax rates. There's a lot of other taxes which we'll talk about in class. But these are essentially the policies that fall under fiscal policy. So let's say, for example, that you have a recession. So I'm drawing out first a recessionary gap. And I should actually say a recession and a recessionary gap are not quite the same. You can see a previous video for that discussion. But I'm going to draw a recessionary gap, which means we're producing below our potential. And remember, the classical theory would say, hey, just wait, things will sort itself out. But again, this was not working during the Great Depression, at least not fast enough, so we needed some other way to intervene. We needed, according to Keynes, instead of waiting on short-run aggregate supply to shift, We need to focus on aggregate demand and find how to propel or push that upwards. Aggregate demand, as a brief reminder, you could think of that as the function of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And so right there you see how fiscal policy might affect aggregate demand. You've got kind of this direct effect through G, through government spending, but then you also have the ability to affect aggregate demand through C and I, through taxes, transfer payments, right? Tax rebates, unemployment benefits, all that kind of stuff. So if you have a recession, how would you increase aggregate demand? So in a recession, you want to increase aggregate demand by increasing government spending and transfer payments, and cutting taxes. You can actually get an idea of how much you need to increase government spending and cut taxes by looking at the multiplier effects. I'm going to save that for another video just to prevent this from growing into another 25-30 minute video. I'm going to try to keep these shorter. So here you have it. In a recession, your goal is to push up aggregate demand. You would do that by increasing government spending and cutting taxes. What about inflation like we've had lately? So if I draw a graph with an inflationary gap, let's get it all labeled here. So we're currently producing here above our potential, and we've got inflation for whatever reason, and we want to slow down the economy. We want to bring aggregate demand back, right? That would be the goal, to bring aggregate demand back to the left. How could we decrease aggregate demand? So during inflation, I'll write it out here. We could decrease aggregate demand by cutting government spending and increasing the taxes that people pay. We're trying to pull money out of the hands of consumers and businesses to slow down the economy and kind of get rid of that inflation. So that's the gist of fiscal policy. So again, what do you really need to focus on? Right? Fiscal policy is going to be the policies made by government, by our elected officials and administrators, that primarily focuses on government spending, taxes, and transfer payments. There are some pros and cons to fiscal policy, and this list is not exhaustive. I am not going to pretend to put together a full list. There's still, even with these, some kind of hand waving, if you will, on my side, because you have some things that could be viewed on either side. So on the pro side, according to Keynes at least, was that fiscal policy would work faster than the classical approach. In theory, right? One of those things. So rather than waiting 4, 5, 10 years for an economy to self-correct, right? Maybe fiscal policy could work in a couple of years. That was the goal. You also, through the introduction of the New Deal, understand that prior to the Great Depression, we had no unemployment benefits, we had no FDIC insurance, just kind of a very different view of the purpose of federal government. But we built in some automatic stabilizers. So if a significant chunk of people lose their job, let's say manufacturing takes a hit for some reason, and 5% of Americans lose their jobs, those 5% are going to get unemployment benefits. It not only helps them keep a roof over their head and, food on the table for their family, but hopefully, right, it's enough that other industries don't start laying off too. So hopefully they're getting enough to still pay their mortgage, to buy their groceries, to support the farmers, right? So the landlord still has money coming in and now they can feed their family. So the idea of these automatic stabilizers is to prevent kind of these like snowballing problems, if you will. They are also there on the inflation side, although actually our government just recently tried to correct for that. But let's say that there's high inflation, so people are earning more money, then in theory more people would fall into higher tax brackets, and some of that income or that higher income would get pulled out of their, essentially out of their checks, right, out of their bank accounts. So that's the idea of the automatic stabilizers. And then again, this is kind of like a one in theory, possibly, you could implement policies or solutions that are good for the long run. So when you go back to the New Deal, some of that, which was included in the New Deal, included, I want to say that's the time period of the Tennessee Valley Water Authority, which we are still kind of a part of or subject to today. It included investment in the arts, but you could also imagine that that might in today's world include investment in infrastructure, roads, other forms of mass transit. Again, the idea of spending, hiring people, pushing money out there, right? I mean, that's what government spending is essentially, is funding programs, putting people to work. So if you were to design the right programs, you might be able to increase your long run aggregate supply at the same time, right? So don't just spend on junk, right? But invest it wisely. And I'm talking about from the government's perspective here. All right, so what are some of the cons to fiscal policy? Well, when Keynes originally came out with this theory, his thoughts were that when the economy's bad, right, that it's okay for the government to run a deficit. Our federal government is the only level in the United States that can run a deficit for operating expenses, meaning like the state of Georgia cannot borrow money to pay Georgia State Patrol, right? The Gwinnett County cannot borrow money to pay Gwinnett firefighters. All of that has to come directly from tax dollars. It has to be fully funded. We can only borrow money when we're building capital projects, new schools, new roads, new libraries, things that are intended to take multiple years to pay off. That is different from our federal government, who is allowed to borrow money for regular operating expenses. So they can borrow money to pay the TSA agents. They can borrow money to pay the folks that work at the IRS. Keynes' theory is that it's okay to borrow money, and you should borrow money to keep people employed and keep spending during the bad economic times. But then he kind of also said that we should slow that down, right, and pay it off during good economic times, but people have kind of ignored that. So what's happened almost every year since FDR took office in 1932, we have run a national deficit. What does that mean? That means we're spending more than we're bringing in. Well, when you do that year after year after year, your national deficits turn into a giant national debt. So we've got a good bit of national debt in this country. In fact, it's roughly equal to the entire size of our GDP, everything that we produce for a single year. With that, of course, comes discussion of the crowding out effects. So remember that when our government borrows money, it increases the interest rate, which discourages private sector borrowing. Other cons is that fiscal policy is still subject to lags. And we're talking about both political and implementation. Technically, there's also one of recognition. So first, right, you're not in a recession until 6 months, right? You've got to have 6 months of falling GDP before anybody's like, uh-oh, we've got a recession. So you got 6 months to recognize the problem. Then you have to get Congress and the president to agree on what to do. And if you're in the United States, you know that we have had different parties in control of the White House and the House or Congress for much of the last 20 years. There might be one wave where a president kind of comes in with the Senate and the House. That usually doesn't last beyond the first 2 years of their presidency. So first of all, you got to get everybody to agree, and that is hard, getting enough votes. And then even once you have the votes, right, it takes time for the policy to be implemented. So if, for example, we decide on a tax credit, so we vote in September for a new tax credit to go into effect, many people may not feel that benefit until the following spring. And then it still takes time to get out and spend the money. Other concerns, perhaps we have some overshooting or even some bad problems. Sorry, not some bad problems, some bad policies. I'm thinking about, for example, when we did a lot of these bailouts for companies back in the 2008-2009 recession, only for many of them to end up going bankrupt or laying off a bunch of people a year or two later. So sometimes the policies that our government creates aren't exactly great, but we could also overshoot. I think everybody was worried, and rightfully so, when the pandemic hit of what that would do to our economy. So we pumped out all this money, right? Everybody got rebate checks multiple times, or COVID checks, whatever you want to call them. And then our economy didn't quite sink, right? And instead, what did we end up with a year or two later? Because so many people had all of this kind of extra money. I hate calling it extra, but in general, people had more money. We ended up with inflation because we had more money chasing after the same or even fewer goods. Perhaps the last major con I should mention is just the politics of it all. So I mentioned bad policies a second ago. Politicians are really subject to the lobbying efforts, right? So which programs we decide to fund and kind of who benefits and who loses is very much a function of who can afford to lobby Congress. You've got your House of Representatives where everybody is elected every 2 years. So they are very much thinking about short-term goals. How do I get reelected? And pursuing what's best in the short run may not always be what's best for us in the long run. So we tend to focus on the short run when we are trying to get reelected, which is not a good thing. All right, so that's the gist of it. Again, I do want to come back in another video and talk about the multiplier effects. What that basically means is that when government spends money or cuts taxes, right, that there's going to be some ripple effects in the economy. So we're going to do those calculations in another video, and I'm going to end this here. As always, please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks and take care.